This part of the lecture, we'll talk about the three types of questions that scientists commonly ask. I like to think of this as the different flavors of questions. So we have the empirical questions, the theoretical questions, and the normative questions. And if you're going to write a survey or you're going to do research, you should understand that when we ask a question, they do have different flavors. So what are empirical questions? Empirical questions usually use the word who, what, when, where, how much, how often, and how many. These are all empirical. So we can ask a question like, who is most likely to be neglected within a home? I believe our data is going to show us that the elderly are likely to be neglected, or small children are likely to be neglected. So that's a who question. Who is most likely to be sexually assaulted? Who's most likely to fail out of college? Those are all empirical questions, and notice they use the word who. Another way we can ask an empirical question is when. When do people drop out of school? When does domestic violence happen? It's an important question we need to ask. So any questions that start with who, what, when, where, how much, how often, and how many are empirical questions. Well, you might have noticed that the word why is missing from empirical questions. And that's because questions that begin with why are theoretical. We're never going to have a definitive answer to that question. We're going to just try to figure out, we're going to create a theory. We have an idea of what's going on. So those are why questions. Some how questions can be theoretical too. So we can ask the question, how does somebody convert to a new religion? That's going to you're going to create sort of a probabilistic answer to that question. Most likely it happens this way, or most likely it happens that way, but it's not as cut and dry as how much money do you spend when you go to the grocery store? How often do you go to the grocery store? How questions that don't have that how much, how often, how many, where it's a little bit more abstract, like how do you convert to a new religion? How do you decide what college to go to? That's a little bit more on the theoretical side, because we're not going to have a definitive answer. We're probably going to have to create some sort of a model about what's going on. So I hope you see the difference between empirical, which is going to give you facts, versus theoretical, which you usually have to talk in terms of probabilities. The last type of question is called normative questions. These questions are things like, should I do this? Should people do that? Should homosexuals be able to adopt children? Should I buy clothes that I know are made by sweatshops? Should women have access to abortion? Now, these questions are different than empirical questions that use facts, different than theoretical questions that require probabilistic reasoning, and instead, they're talking about morality. They're talking about how we should live, how it's appropriate to do things. And in general, scientists don't ask normative questions. Science doesn't try to give a definitive answer to normative questions. You're never going to see a scientist say, we've used science, and homosexuals should be able to adopt children. They're not going to do that. They might say that children who grow up in homosexual households show no difference from children who grow up in heterosexual households. That's a scientific claim saying, hey, there's no difference between these two groups empirically. There's no apparent differences in terms of mental health, in terms of happiness, in terms of safety. There's no difference between those two families. But that's different than should homosexuals be able to adopt children. Scientists are not going to answer that question. That's a morality question. So, but here's where it gets a little confusing. A lot of people who collect data with surveys will ask Americans, should we defund the police? Should homosexuals be able to get married? Should abortion be accessible to women? And what we do is we're collecting that data to tell other people, to say, hey, this is what public opinion is. This is how Americans feel about abortion, or about gay marriage, or about the police. But the scientist is never saying, and what people think is what should be. They're just reporting the facts. So in a way, Science never asks normative questions, but scientists will ask everyday people normative questions. So that's where you see opinion polling. We'll collect the data and we'll say, hey, Americans actually really do think that everyone should have access to abortion. And we have the data, we've collected the data. But that doesn't mean that that's the moral thing to do. It doesn't mean that's what the law should do. It doesn't mean that's what science has proven. They're just reporting the facts of what people are saying about a normative or moral issue. Another way you could ask is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to do this? Is it appropriate to do that? Again, science is not going to tell us what's appropriate, but a scientist might ask people, do you think it's appropriate for someone to do this or appropriate to do that? And then they report that out in their scientific papers. But the scientist will say, this doesn't mean that science has found anything, because science doesn't really discover morality. That's coming from people. If this is confusing to you, let me know next class. I can talk about it a little bit more. But the thing I'm trying to get you to see is that we have questions that'll give you facts, questions that'll give you that require a probabilistic answer, like theoretical questions, and then you've got your normative questions, which is about morality and appropriateness. And we can ask people those questions, but that doesn't mean science, agrees. We just report what we find. And those are normative questions. And now I'm going to offer you an example of each type of question. So here's our first question. Are women paid less than men for the same type of work? That's a yes or no empirical question. You have one woman who's teaching at Copper Mountain College, you have a man teaching at Copper Mountain College. Is the woman paid less than the man for the same type of work? It's a yes or no question, and it's empirical. You're going to get a fact. Number 2. Why are women paid less than men for the same type of work? Again, we're not looking for a factual answer for this. We're looking for a possible group of reasons why this might be going on, and it's going to be very complex, and you're going to be based on probabilities. The last example of we have a normative question. Should women be paid the same as men for the same work? Notice again, science is not going to definitively say, yes, women should be paid the same as men for the same type of work. Science is going to say, we asked, 1,000 people, and 99% of people believe women should be paid the same as men for the same type of work. We just report out the facts to that normative question, but that doesn't mean science has found that, other than it found it as a fact, or that that's the moral thing to do, or that's what legally we should do. It's just reporting out what people believe about morality, about appropriateness. So those are our 3 examples. They're all on the same topic. One's empirical, one's theoretical, one's normative. Notice the key words. Why, when you have a theoretical question. Should, is it appropriate, ought. We use those for normative questions. And then for the empirical question, in this case, it's are women paid less than men? But we could ask a question like, what are women and men paid for the same job? So that would be a what question. Or how much money are women paid compared to men for the same job? So it would fit our pattern perfectly, but the empirical questions generally say who, what, where, when, how much, how often, how many. So if you see those keywords, you are looking at an empirical question.